So I'm at the tail end of kind of a chest cold thing going on here, so if I lose my voice halfway through this and start coughing, that's why. But it's good to see everybody here today. Kind of a tough passage we're dealing with. We're going to be talking today a little bit about confronting sin. And confronting sin is not something, generally speaking, that we enjoy doing. In fact, confrontation at all is not something that we generally enjoy doing. I suppose there's a few people that thrive off that kind of drama in their life, but most of us don't like it. And most of the time, when we experience confrontation or have to go through it, it makes us feel uncomfortable. In fact, I remember, and by the way, I see people fanning. It is a little warm in here, and so we have turned on the air conditioning. So by about 2 hours after you're gone, it should be a comfortable temperature in here. But I remember a time when I felt really uncomfortable, and it was when, believe it or not, it was when, I can feel it right here. We were buying a house. We had moved back to Florida in about 2008, and we stayed in this small little apartment at first, and then we were looking for a place, and we found a townhouse that we wanted to buy. It was a new build, and so the home builder was selling the houses, and we had gone and checked it out, and so we came back with our realtor. And our realtor at that time was a younger gal named Heather, who was about this tall. And she asked us, before we went in, she said, "What do you want to pay for this house?" And so we said, well, we could probably go as high as, and she said, no, not what are you willing to pay, but what do you want to pay? Like, what's your dream price for this house? And so we told her, we said X amount of dollars. I'm not going to tell you, right? We told her how much, and she said, okay. And so in we go, and we go into the model home, and we go into one of the bedrooms of the model home that had been converted to a little office, and we sit down with the representative for the builder. And she tells him, here's what my buyers want this house for. And it was significantly less than what they were asking. And so the guy basically was like, no, there's no way we can do that. He's like, we wouldn't make any money. We can't sell them that low. And she was like, yes, you can. And she busts out like a pad of paper and a pen, and she starts crunching numbers. She's like, look, here's what your costs are, and I know this. And the guy's like, well, we're throwing in appliances. And she's like, I've been a general contractor. I know what you guys pay for that. That's nothing. That's a write-off. And she's like, here, this and that. And she's really going after it. And finally, he's like, well, maybe if you give up some of your commission and put that towards the house, we could get close to that number. And she's like, no, I'm not giving up my commission. And she's just wrangling with this guy back and forth, and he's getting mad. You can, like, his face is red, and he's starting to, he's get angry. And my wife and I are sitting there, and we're like, I mean, Heather, who was like, in the chair, she was only this tall, And, but she's going after this guy, and I was a probation officer at the time. I used to arrest people, and that didn't make me uncomfortable, but this did, right? I was uncomfortable sitting there, and so finally the guy cracks, and he goes, all right, well, let me call my boss and see what I can do. And so he walks out of the room, and he's gone for a long time, but he finally comes back in, and we got it, the exact price that we wanted to get it for, and Heather kept her full commission. And so, but it was really, so we were happy with the outcome, but the actual confrontation part was really uncomfortable. It was not an enjoyable time. And that's something that's just a sales negotiation. Imagine when you're confronting someone about a personal issue. Something that you or someone that you love is involved with, some behavior that's hurtful to themselves or hurting other people in their life. And you have to go and you have to confront them on that and tell them what they're doing and how it's hurting people and that they need to stop. That's even more difficult. In fact, I think that's why a lot of times when you have fights and arguments in families, they turn into big blow-ups because you have such a difficult time ever bringing those things up, and so you put it off because you want to avoid that confrontation. And so you don't deal with issues, and you wait and you wait and you wait until they finally grow so big that you just explode. Well, in today's passage, as we're continuing with our series on Be the Church, and the story of the church in Corinth and how they learned how to be the church, we see today that they're having the same problem. They're having difficulty confronting the sin of one of their members. Paul has written to them and has told them that he knows all about this. It's not like they didn't know. He wasn't telling them something they didn't know. They knew that was the problem. They knew, and they weren't doing anything about it. And so he says, a guy has his father's wife, which we assume means he married his stepmom. We hope, because of the way it's phrased, that's what we assume. We're not even sure, so it could have even been worse than what it sounds like. But even if it was just that, that's bad enough. Because as Paul points out, even the pagans don't approve of that business. And yet, you guys have done nothing. You haven't confronted this guy. You haven't held him accountable. In fact, you're even boasting about it. And so he sets them straight that this can't continue, that they need to do something different because they are different, because they are God's people, and they need to live according to God's way and not the world's way. But that was just the problem. One of the reasons that the Corinthian church had failed to confront this sin was because they were still living according to the world's way. And in the world, at that time, honor for a man was based on status. It was based on his position. It was based on his power and authority. So if you had a guy that was wealthy and powerful and had high status, that's what brought him honor. That's what made, you would say, that's an honorable man. He's brought honor on himself because he's managed to achieve that status in his life. And his personal problems, his personal failings, his personal immorality wouldn't really have much of any bearing on that. And to be honest, that's not too different from the view that we have today sometimes. You see it a lot with politicians. Who's heard of a guy named Rob Ford? You guys heard of Rob Ford? Rob Ford is the mayor of Toronto. He's been in the news a bit lately. So Rob Ford is a guy who, even on a good day, was basically like a Chris Farley character come to life. He was big, fat, loud, and sweaty, and like every time you saw him. And he was well known, even before he got in trouble, for going out on the town, partying it up with people, taking pictures with people. They'd shoot YouTube videos of him acting wild and crazy. And he became this really popular mayor, well, until it turned out that, along the way, he smoked some crack. And so that he got called before the city council in Toronto, and they asked him, and he admitted it. He said, yes, it's true. And they said, well, we think you ought to step down and resign as mayor. And he said, no. He refused to step down, and part of his reasoning was because that was his private life. That was his personal life. Didn't affect his job as mayor. And you know what? A lot of people still support him. And, lest we think we're just picking on our Canadian neighbors, I believe without naming any names, we've had some American presidents that we've done the same thing with. And this is what the Corinthians were doing. This guy was probably a man of some power and some status and some wealth in society, and so they were giving him a pass on his personal failings. And the Apostle Paul says, no, that's not right. And I'll tell you the other thing they were doing is they were probably afraid of offending him. They were probably afraid that if they said to him, that's not what we're supposed to do, that's not how we're supposed to live, that he would leave. And they didn't want to lose him because he was a man of power and position and authority and wealth. In fact, that's probably what this whole thing was about. Many scholars and some commentators believe that what was going on here was that back then, you see, in the city of Corinth, they actually had kind of a progressive idea about marriage, which was that a woman brought her wealth with her. So like when you married someone, you got her dowry, right? Some of her family wealth. But if she ever left and remarried, it didn't stay with the family. You didn't get to keep it. It went with her. And so they think what actually was happening was, this guy's dad had died, and if she remarried someone else out of the family, they would have lost her money and her wealth that she had brought with her. And so in order to keep that from happening, the son married her. So to keep it in the family, as it were. And so this is what was going on. And so he was a guy that was wealthy and powerful. And the church in Corinth was proud of that. They were proud that that guy was a patron of their church. They were proud that that guy was a member of their church. And they didn't want to lose that over some sticky moral issue. And so Paul writes, and he's got to set them straight. And he's got to tell them that this is not the way that you were called to live. In fact, if you want to turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I'm going to reference a couple verses through there as we go through. In verse 6, he says, "Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast, so that you may be a new, unleavened batch, as you really are." Now, he's using this bread metaphor because he was talking about Passover. And he referenced Passover and how Jesus sacrificed himself as our Passover lamb to forgive our sins. And then he says this verse, the point of which is that we have become new. We're not the old unleavened bread, but we're not the old leavened bread, but we're the new unleavened bread, the Passover bread, the bread that's been made new. And so essentially what he's saying is, why are you living the old way? Why are you living the world's way when you should be living a new way? When you should be living God's way? Because if you were living a new way, if you were living God's way, you would have confronted this sin that's afflicting your community. And I like how he says, "as you really are," because that's something you'll hear us talk about a lot here at Holy Cross. That when we talk about living the life that we are supposed to live, never do we make it about us. It's never about, you just need to try harder and work harder and make better decisions. It's about knowing and understanding that you already have been changed. That Jesus already has come into your life and forgiven your sins and made you a new person, as you really are. And so now, live that way. Now live as the person that you already are. That's what Paul is telling them, and that's what he's telling us. But I have to ask the question, are we really so different from the Corinthians? Because I think we as a church and as people also sometimes fail to confront sin in our lives and to confront sin in the lives of those around us. Why is that? Why do we fail to confront sin? And I think a huge part of it for us, and it's something that I myself feel really strongly about, is because we don't want to judge and condemn people. I think many of us have experienced times and places where we have gone into a church or we have met with other Christian people, and what we've experienced from them is not grace and love and forgiveness, but what we've experienced is judgment and condemnation. Certainly there were times in the history of the Christian church when that was true. And we've heard stories about churches where there is no grace, and it's all about what you do, and are you doing what's right, rather than what God has done for you. I was on Facebook the other day. Someone had posted a blog, not their blog, but they shared it on their wall. And it was written by a woman who's a Christian woman and a Christian writer now. And she was talking about some of her early experiences with Christianity. And one of those was, she admitted that as a younger woman, she had made some mistakes. And in fact, she had become pregnant without being married and a single mom. But she felt God, kind of tugging at her. She knew something was missing from her life, and so she wanted to go to church, but she was so afraid to go because she was afraid of the condemnation. She was full of guilt and shame. And so finally, one day, she goes, and she cries all the way there. And she went in, and it was exactly what she feared. She was met with judgment and condemnation rather than love and mercy. And she said she left crying and didn't go back to a church again for like 10 years. Nobody wants to be that church. Nobody wants to be the church that is known for judging people and that gives an attitude more of hate than of love. And so a lot of times, because of that, because we want to show grace, because we want to show love, because we want to show mercy, we miss out on opportunities to confront sinful behavior, to confront behaviors that are hurtful to ourselves or that are hurtful to those around us. And instead, you know what we really like to do instead? We feel like we got to stand up for that somehow. So instead of pointing at ourselves and instead of pointing at those close to us, we like to point at people outside. We like to point at things in the world. You know, we like to point out Hollywood celebrities and political lobbyists that support things we don't agree with or think are immoral. How many of you saw the Grammys? How many of you did not see the Grammys, but then read articles after them about how horrible they were? Right? More of you. Now, I'm not defending what went on there, but I am saying that to point to the Grammys and complain about the Grammys can be a way of avoiding dealing with stuff in your life and dealing with stuff in the lives of those that are close to you and dealing with stuff in your community of faith, because that's easier, because it's safer, because you don't care about offending Justin Bieber, because we all hate him. No, I'm just kidding. Chris is waiting for me to just say I'm joking, right? Like, you can't just leave that. Poor guy. That's right. Poor guy with his millions of dollars. But no, that's a great example, though, right? We love to hate that kid because he's screwing up his life. But I mean, that's easy to point to him. And I'd go so far as to say, at least at times, it can even be an excuse. It's a distraction. You know, Paul tells the Corinthians in verse 12, "What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church?" He goes on and says, God is going to judge those people. Now, our job is to judge those inside the church. We should look first to ourselves, not to the people outside. We find that hard to do because we don't want to. We don't want to condemn anyone. We don't want to hurt anyone. We don't want to judge anyone. But what Paul is telling the Corinthians here and us is that it's not about condemnation. Actually, it's about grace. If you read what he says about that man in verse 5, he says, and this is tough to take, he says, hand this man over to Satan, which, I mean, you know, that's pretty strong. Hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. But why? Because of grace, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. See, when done properly, when done appropriately, confronting someone about their sins and their destructive behaviors is an act of love. It's an act of mercy. It's an act of sincerity and truth, because we confront people to help them. We confront ourselves and those close to us so that they can experience the mercy and the grace and the forgiveness of Jesus Christ. And so that they don't have to experience the pain and suffering that their behavior is going to bring them. This is a hypothetical example, but it's realistic enough that it wouldn't surprise me at all if some of you have been in this exact situation. But if you know someone that is about to throw their life away to chase after an affair, to cheat on their spouse, man or woman, it doesn't matter, because it happens to both. And you know the pain that that's going to bring them in the long run for a momentary pleasure. And you know the pain that's going to bring their family, and you know the destructiveness that's going to bring to their children. And you say to them, you call them out and say to them, hey man, you are messing up. You are going to hurt a lot of people, and it's wrong. That's not an act of condemnation. That's an act of mercy. Because you want them to be saved from that. Because you want them to be able to experience the good life that Jesus has for them. I heard some statistics, and the first ones are kind of a little frightening, or sad anyway. They're about divorce. The number, and they fluctuate a little bit from year to year, but they've been holding pretty steady. The percentage of first marriages that end in divorce in the United States, so all people in the United States, first marriages, percentage that end in divorce, like 51%. Right around 50%, so half. I was listening to a radio program the other day, and they were talking about this statistic, and they were asking the question, are we any different in the church? And so they looked at a statistics for among those that identify themselves as Christian, the divorce rate is 51%. The same, no different. And that can seem disheartening at first. But then the guy I was listening to, it was like an interview segment. He said, I heard that, and that's sad, and it actually is true. And he said, but I wanted to find out a little bit more because I felt there must be something different. And so he looked at more statistics, and he found that for those that attend church faithfully, which is kind of a good marker of being involved in your faith and taking it seriously, for those that attend church faithfully, that number drops by like 20%. It's much better. Still not perfect, but much better. Because Jesus has given us a different way to live, and it is better. It makes a difference. It's living in His grace and His mercy and His forgiveness as we are. Who we really are in Jesus Christ. Don't go back to the old way, to that old bread. Stay with the new, because it's a better way to live. And so it's okay to confront sin, because we do it out of love, and it helps us to experience the gift that Jesus has given us. It helps us to experience His grace. And so in His name, amen.